30 years ago, you took the stage in London at very short notice, replacing Michael Tilson-Thomas. And from there, you started an international career in conducting, and you've been working globally as a conductor and composer. Could you explain to me and to the audience, what is it that you do as a conductor? What is conducting and leadership?
That's a big question, of course. There are some aspects about conducting that are quantifiable rather easily, and then there's a great deal of stuff that is much more difficult to analyze and describe. But if I start from the quantifiable aspect of conducting, it really is the main function of a conductor is to distribute music in time, i.e. we take care of the flow of the music. We do have a concept of the piece that we're performing, and we relay that concept to the orchestra, to the players, and try to convince them about the quality of the concept. Experience helps in this, and of course we try to inspire and help the musicians to perform it really well on a very high level, and possibly with something extra that wasn't there previously.
You're known, I think, as a very precise conductor. Many people say that of you, but you've also been, some of your colleagues in the orchestras have said that it feels like Esa-Pekka is driving an extremely fast car on a narrow road, and when you conduct. And there was a quote you've recently said on Stravinsky's Firebird. You said, well, you should push them, the orchestra, but not beyond the invisible wall beyond which things start breaking apart. Can you talk about control and letting go?
I think my long-term experience about control versus inspiration, control versus freedom, controlling versus enabling musicians, this has been one continuous learning process, but I would say that as a young conductor, I was much more interested in controlling everything. I had an illusion of my own importance in the big picture, and of course, as you get older and you work with fantastic musicians, fantastic orchestras, you start to realize that the most important function of a leader in that kind of context is to enable people, to give them tools to actually do their work, do their job as they can, as they have been trained to do. And that is actually the one lesson that I'm carrying from all those years. And now I must say that I get a lot of pleasure out of the fact that I don't think that I'm irreplaceable. I don't think that I'm omnipotent. I see my role as primus inter pares, working together with extremely talented people, trying to give them impulses and ideas and concepts, but by no means thinking that I'm on a higher level than any one of them.
There's another aspect to control, which is, if you like, self-control, and music it grabs all of us in a way that we can't always anticipate. And recently you were discussing your violin concerto, which was premiered in 2009, a beautiful piece if you haven't heard it. And you were saying that from a section that, and this is a place where it's easy to get sucked in, but you have to consciously cool down. That even the composer can get drawn in, and then you have the guy at the baton who's lost control.
Well, control is obviously important in this profession or any profession, but of course control is not a goal in itself. We have to see control as a tool to achieve certain goals, and in music, obviously the great classical repertoire has a very powerful emotional message, and the emotional content is very strong, and as a conductor we get very moved and very sort of inspired by all this at all times, but we have to be wary of the sort of centrifugal powers of this music, that we don't want to get sucked in completely, because that would mean that you actually lose your ability to help the others to achieve the goal. So you have to keep some kind of a distance, even minimally, but there has to be some kind of detachment between you and the material you are actually dealing with at any given moment.
One core thing is to keep learning, no matter how much one knows. And it might be the case when you get up in front of an orchestra, you de facto know the piece better than any individual player there in some sense. You've prepared it and know all aspects of it. But how do you stay open to surprises and learning from your colleagues?
First of all, I don't think that I'm necessarily the most profoundly talented person in the room when I conduct an orchestra. On the contrary, I'm willing to accept the fact that statistically it's more likely that there are a few who would be more talented and have perhaps more knowledge about the encyclopedic knowledge about the piece that we are performing. But that's not the point, really. It's more like that I try to enable this talent to in a cohesive way, to work together in order to achieve a goal. And in order to keep the situation dynamic and alive, one has to be open to impulses from the orchestra back to the conductor. Otherwise it would be kind of meaningless. So in fact, what happens is some kind of a feedback loop almost, that I throw an idea or an impulse to the players, and then they give me something back. And I take it, all this happens in real time, as it were, and instinctively, intuitively, and not necessarily rationally. But there's this kind of feedback loop. I hear what they're giving back to me. There might be some kind of idea which I'm detecting, and I have to make a split-second decision whether I accept it and run with it, or whether I reject it, or try to guide the musicians into a different direction. And that, of course, makes it endlessly fascinating, because no day is like the previous one, or no second, no one moment in that kind of music making is similar to any other moment that I have experienced before. And therefore, now when I've been doing this for more than 30 years, scary number by the way, I have realized that the most profound pleasure, the greatest joy I can ever experience is the realization that I've learned something. And how do I learn something? I learn something from these talented, dedicated, very well-trained people I work with around the world.
In business, as in music, feedback, you mentioned the feedback loop, even during a live performance. But as you're getting ready for performance, how do you give feedback if there's something you need to correct? And how do you take feedback? And if you can be very precise, like really.
Feedback works, as we all know, feedback works on very different levels. There is the direct feedback, i.e. verbal. Somebody says, no, I don't think so. Or somebody says, okay, I think that's a very good idea. Then there is this other kind of feedback. You can read this in people's faces. You can read it between the lines. You can tell that there's something funny about the atmosphere now. What I did or what I said wasn't somehow taken well. And then in music, of course, there's this kind of feedback where you do something, you give an impulse to the musicians, and then something comes back that was not what you thought it would have been, or maybe it's not as good as you thought it should have been. And I think that's the most profound sort of feedback I'm experiencing, that I'm expecting to hear something, at some kind of reaction, and then something else happens. And then, of course, I have to make this split-second judgment whether this is actually something I accept, or something I reject, or something I actually think is better than what I had to offer. And that makes it absolutely fascinating. You use technology in your work. You're
perhaps the only classical composer conductor who has been featured in a Football World Cup TV spot. So going really mainstream with the commercials together with Apple for iPad and those methods. How does technology serve in your daily work and in composing?
Well, the way we use technology in classical music is basically divided into two categories. There's of course the technology to distribute music, i.e. through streaming and through social media and so on, using various consumer electronics methods such as iPads, iPods, tablets, what have you. Then there's of course the other side, which is technology we use in the actual creation process of music, and I use, in my composition process, I use software, I use computers, I use MIDI systems, sequencers, notation software, and so on, which is fairly normal these days, even in the so-called classical circles. We are not as hopelessly analog as people think. There's still a lot to do, but many of us use technology and the best software available and so on. In order to get the message across to the larger audiences, I think we have a lot to do still. And what I've been doing together with my colleagues at the Philharmonia is to try to kind of invent new ways to bring classical music, the great repertoire, the great experiences, closer to people who basically communicate with the world through touchscreens and that sort of interface. And the few pilots, actually quite a few of them already, have been very successful. And we are now convinced that this is the way to go, and that we will develop further the concept that we started with a few years ago.
And if you'd like to hear more, a little plug for the rest of the program. At 2:30 p.m. on the green stage, we start the product design track at Slush, and Esa-Pekka and Richard Stanley, his collaborator on the orchestra app, as well as some other installations, will be giving more detail on that work. Finally, great creative breakthroughs are often about the team you assemble. And oftentimes, I suppose you are meeting a team that you've worked with for a long time or in front of a new orchestra. How do you develop talent, and how do you seek new talent?
I was the chief conductor or the music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic for 17 years. And in that capacity, I hired about 60 musicians. So I have a lot of experience of trying to find the talent, and then having found it, trying to nurture it and trying to guide it into the right direction. And of course, this is an incredibly complex field, but I think it's absolutely central for us as well as every one of you out there. How do we find talent? How do we encourage it? How do we nurture it? And how do we keep it within our organization? That's also a big challenge sometimes when the most talented people, of course, have a lot of demand around the world. And how do we keep them motivated? How do we make sure that they can flourish in the environment we are creating, so that they would stay loyal to the organization and to ourselves? And of course, as I said, maybe the most important thing for the leader in this context is to realize that he or she is just an enabler, not some kind of all-knowing, faultless thing that would never make mistakes and instead would just kind of lay out fantastic strategies that would take the organization to ever new heights. It doesn't work this way. I think what we do is really to, as I said, give impulses, ideas, and try to make sure that everyone within the organization feels that he or she has been seen, has been noted, and is supported in whatever the goals of the organization are.
I think with those words, I think good something to aspire to for any startup CEO or leader in a great organization. Thank you, Esa-Pekka, for being at Slush. We continue at 2:30 Green Stage.
Thank you very much.